Hey everyone, today we are reading Acts chapter 24. We're going to go all the way through the chapter to chapter 25, verse 23. Now, the events in today's reading prove that the Jewish people really want Paul killed. They have and will continue to go through extreme measures to make sure that Paul is no longer living. If you'll remember from yesterday's reading, Paul has just been transferred to Caesarea because there was a threat against his life in Jerusalem. The governor of Judea agrees to hear Paul's case, but first puts him in prison at the king of Judea's headquarters and makes him wait 5 days. And after 5 days, the high priest and a few Jewish elders and a lawyer named Tertullus come to plead their case against Paul to Governor Felix. Now, just a side note here, Governor Felix was not known to be a good governor. In fact, he was known to be very cruel and quite a horrible person. So jump back into the story. Tertullus was a lawyer. He was probably a Gentile lawyer, and he states his case, the case of the Jewish people, against Paul to Governor Felix. And he accuses him of 3 things. He says Paul has stirred up riots, he is a Christian ringleader, and he has profaned the temple. Paul denies the first and third things, but then says this about the second charge. We're going to go to chapter 24, verses 14 to 16. But I admit that I follow the way, which they call a cult. I worship the God of our ancestors, and I firmly believe the Jewish law and everything written in the prophets. I have the same hope in God that these men have, that he will raise both the righteous and unrighteous. Because of this, I always try to maintain a clear conscience before God and all people. Now, after hearing Paul's defense of himself, Felix adjourned the hearing and places Paul back in custody. In a couple different ways, Felix pushes off the need to decide Paul's case. And during this time, Felix meets with Paul privately, and during these meetings, Paul told him about the good news, about faith in Jesus. Felix becomes quite frightened, though, after some of the things that Paul says, especially in response to what Paul has to say about judgment, because Felix himself feels very convicted. So Felix stops meeting with Paul and continues to hold him in prison. Once again, proving that he was a horrible person, Felix hopes that by keeping Paul in prison, keeping him detained, that Paul will eventually bribe him to get out. Now, that doesn't happen, though, and 2 years pass, and Felix is removed from leadership, and a man named Festus takes over in his place. He keeps Paul in prison because he wants to remain in good standing with the Jewish people. Now, the Jewish people waste no time in getting to Festus about Paul's case. 3 days after Festus takes leadership, they meet with him in Jerusalem to talk about Paul. Festus returns to Caesarea, takes his place in court, and calls Paul before him to hear his case. Now, long story short, in response to Festus asking Paul if he would go back to Jerusalem to be tried, Paul says this. We're gonna jump to chapter 25, verses 10 and 11. Paul says this. Let me get my page back. Paul says this. No, this is the official Roman court, so I ought to be tried right here. You know very well I am not guilty of harming Jews. If I have done something worthy of death, I don't refuse to die. But if I am innocent, no one has a right to turn me over to these men to kill me. I appeal to Caesar. Paul uses his Roman citizenship to call to be tried before Caesar. Now, a couple of chapters ago, in chapter 23, if you'll remember, Paul hears a word from the Lord that says that he will be given an opportunity to preach the good news in Rome, to tell people about Jesus in Rome. And Paul has been doing everything to try and get to Rome in order to preach the good news. Prison hasn't even been able to stop him. So now, Paul has just made it possible for him to go to Rome, and the government is making it happen. Paul's faithfulness to the mission that God has given him is an incredible testimony and witness to the power of God. the circumstances that Paul has endured and yet still remained faithful to God's call. It shows that he is all about the mission. He doesn't care what happens to him, only that the mission of God continues. Now, as we finish up the book of Acts, Paul's story is going to unfold, and God is going to continue to use him to share his good news. It reminds me of a phrase that I once heard in school that has stuck with me, and I probably shared it here before, but it's wherever you've been and wherever you're going, God is already up to something. It's a reminder for me to take every moment to make every moment that God gives me count. To be aware of how God is working all around me to both celebrate his faithfulness, but also join him on his mission. I want to live in the same way that Paul did, all about God's mission, but I fail. I get distracted, I get discouraged, and sometimes it's just downright tired. By pointing to Jesus, Paul reminds us that there is no life better than a life lived on mission for God. So I become really grateful for grace and God's loving prompts to turn my focus back to him, to join him on his mission here on this earth. So let's live all about God's mission here. I hope that you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.
If these devotional videos are helpful to you, subscribe to our channel and click the notification button so you know when we post a new video. And of course, please share them with others.